and welcome again to Fascism on Film. I'm James Kent. Along with me is Teal Minton.
Hey, how's it going?
And today we are going to stay in Italy, and we're going to, I know, not literally, but for film-wise, we're going to stay in Italy, and we're going to discuss a film, and it's weird, release-wise in the United States, I guess it came out in 1971.
Yeah.
But it was, probably released in Italy in 1970. It was The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, and it's directed by a very famous Italian filmmaker, De Sica. He was an international acclaimed actor, and then also an acclaimed filmmaker. I mean, in almost an equal amounts. I mean, this guy was in like over 100 movies. So it wasn't like, oh, he starred in a few films and then he got into film making. No, I mean, this guy, he was even nominated for supporting actor in the Oscars for his acting.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And he was been in tons of stuff, and he's actually something where you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that was the guy. And he really is one of the founding fathers of Italian neorealism.
Yeah.
Directed The Bicycle Thieves, very famous.
Which is just considered sort of a masterpiece, classic cinema. It's a film that's taught over and over again.
Yeah, and he also did a film on Berto D, and he won like 3 Oscars, I believe, for best international film, which was foreign film back then. And this was Italy's entry. And I mentioned on our last episode with The Conformist, which came out at the same time, that it was not nominated. It wasn't submitted by Italy for consideration. And I kind of feel like that The Conformist is the better movie, but it was one of those things that Oscars, De Sica was such a revered person.
Yeah, and this film is a little bit easier to take in and handle. It's a little bit more of a mass audience kind of film.
But it is a little bit more digestible. I mean, it's based on a famous book, and I guess there was a lot of like tension and trying to get the screenplay right, and some the writer, I think, of the book was upset about the changes they made.
It's based on sort of his Giorgio Bassani's sort of semi-autobiographical novel about him coming of age during the 30s in Italy. And he worked on the screenplay with De Sica until they had a little bit of a creative difference. And basically, there's a romance in the movie between the character Giorgio, who's the main character, and Nicole, who's one of the Finzi-Continis. And this romance is not in the book to the extent that it is in the movie, if at all. And so the author, Bassani, really thought that this kind of trivialized the political weight of the story by introducing this love story. He really didn't like it. So he disavowed the film and took his name off it.
Persnickety. This Micol character, who's a Finzi-Contini, is played by a French actress named Dominique Sanda, who's still around, still alive. I don't know if she acts anymore. But the interesting thing is she was the main important female role in The Conformist.
Right, yes.
Yeah, the one we were talking about the last time, where she played a few different roles, and she is the professor's wife. And she is also the love triangle interest in Bertolucci's 1900.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And
so that's interesting. She's got a fascist resume going on there.
Yes. And she'd actually helped develop the idea with Bertolucci for Last Tango in Paris. And she was supposed to play that role, but she got pregnant and decided against it.
Oh, well, good for her.
Yeah. Well, I don't, maybe it would have been different because she had worked on the idea with him. But anyways.
So this movie, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, is about a Italian Jewish aristocratic family called the Finzi-Continis. And they live in a city in Italy, and they have an estate that it's hard to tell. It's just this massive estate, but it's sort of up against the city. And so they have a wall that's in the city. and then just this massive estate. And this family doesn't leave their estate really for any reason. And fascism has been sort of embedded in Italian culture already, but is the film sort of covers from 1938 to about 1943, beginning with the anti-Jewish laws that Mussolini put in 1938 called the leggi razziali laws. And so it sort of starts with those and views this family as they stay isolated, and the world sort of changes around them, and they think they're kind of above it, and ultimately they're not.
Well, because they live in like a fortress in a sense, right? But it's also a prison, right? It's
a prison of their own making. They refuse to. I mean, they don't leave for any reason. They just have everything they need there, and they sort of see themselves as being above the world and above it all, and that these things won't affect them. And when the laws first come in, these anti-Jewish laws, one of the stipulations that affects them is that the Jews can no longer have servants, or domestiques, as they call them. And so this would affect the Finzi-Continis, except they put some money here and there. There's a point where Micol says, our father is a big donor to government charities, and they sort of think that will help them slide through, and it does for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting in this film, the look at how fascism I would say how fascism played out in Italy, but I mean, fascism started in Italy. But I guess the influence of Nazism on fascism, and how the closer that the country started to get towards European World War, that Mussolini, in order to cement that pact, kind of had to adapt more of the Nazis' posture and their racial laws, because before that, they really didn't have those. They really weren't concerned about Jews. And for a good portion of this film, even with those laws, it's kind of it's kind of played as an inconvenience more than a hardship. I see parallels to things that are happening in our country today on that fact, where it just feels like, well, it's not really inconveniencing me. And the scope of these, immigration deportations, they seem to happen in pockets or this and that. And, it's something that people kind of can live with, even if they're not happy with. Like the neighbors, I guess, and this Giorgio guy, his real life, his counterpart in the film, they go to play tennis at the Finzi-Continis because if you're Jewish, you can't play at the clubs anymore. But at the Finzi-Continis, they got a nice court there.
Yeah, and so that's the opening scene, is a bunch of young people, college students. I think they're probably in their early 20s. Giorgio is doing his thesis on poetry. He's a college student. Or at least he's studying. And so the opening scene is they've sort of all been kicked out of the tennis club, and they go over to the Finzi-Continis to play tennis and hang out in this sort of almost like a Garden of Eden in the middle of this, that's sort of out of time and out of place, and not really affected by everything that's going on.
Yeah, and it's interesting because De Sica, with his neorealist background. And then there was a stretch that he didn't really have a hit, and it may have been as like the film, he had these neorealist hits, and then the film industry started changing again, and that style, I don't think he was as comfortable, and this was his first hit in many years.
Oh, interesting.
The film is very, I wouldn't say it's overly cinematic, just even though his framings and setups as almost like a guy who was really good with that handheld neorealist style, and then having to kind of do more of that Hollywood or whatever the Italian industry film feel. It's like sometimes feels like a mismatch, and I also feel like he's a little heavy-handed trying to make his points. Like there's these zooms in on things that
I like that, the zoom in on the on like the Jewish symbols over the doorway, or at the,
but it's almost funeral. Like, I don't want you to miss this. Look, and it's like,
well, I don't know. So I watched this film a couple of times, and it really warmed up over time for me. I wasn't crazy about it at first, but I think that glossy sort of cinematography, sort of the hazy glossy, is sort of an indictment of memory and how when we look back on these things, they are a little bit glossy. And so the film is sort of serving as a comment on the memory of Italian audiences in 1970 and how the country is looking back on this period of fascism through this lens that's sort of gauzy and glossy.
I'm not saying I did dislike the movie. I'm just saying that I found it less heavy-handed this go around than the first time I watched it. But I did think it was an interesting build-up over, of course, Giorgio, his family is actually outside the walls, and you see a little bit more of the effect and this family that kind of really understands that this situation is not good.
Well,
except for the father, right? The father's the one who's
I was going to bring up the father because I actually, there's a scene early on. So it has this opening with the tennis, and then he goes home. Giorgio goes home, and it's the day that the newspaper has come out announcing these anti-Jewish laws. And his father is actually saying, "Oh, things aren't so bad." And then he shows him the paper, and I actually wrote down his father's line here because I think so. There's a few scenes that sort of come up in a lot of fascist films about fascism, and one of them is it's actually not so bad scene. And so I actually wrote down the father's line here because I thought it was so powerful. It's I understand how you feel. You have to admit we're not so badly off here. Granted, no more mixed marriages. That's actually not too. No phone listings, no public schools, and that I must agree is serious. So is being barred from the armed forces, no obituaries in the newspaper, and now no servants. But apart from that, you'll admit we can still live, move about, own property. In effect, be a citizen.
Yeah.
Right. And so and Giorgio is like, yeah, but third-class citizen. And he's like, yes, but we can still enjoy our basic rights. And he's really trying to convince himself that this isn't as bad as it is. And Giorgio's like, no, actually, it's really bad. It's terrible. Like, and it's going to get worse. And his father is kind of in denial about it. Even once war is declared, his father's like, well, we're not at the stage of needing to leave the country yet.
Giorgio and his mother and I think sister, they actually escape.
Yes.
To where, we don't know. Like, well, obviously safety because the Giorgio got a chance to write this book. But but the father stays behind.
The father stays behind and gets captured at the end of the movie. And it's the father's naivete about what's happening and his desire to sort of, he keeps saying, well, we're Italians. One thing I think is really interesting is the pre-war Jewish Italian population was only about 45,000 people.
Right.
So it was a very small group, and not all of them were taken and deported to concentration camps. A lot of them were, but something like 80% of Italian Jews survived the Holocaust.
It happened very late. And that's what I thought was interesting about this film. And for those, maybe it's why we have it a little bit further down in our first season, is that, you might think, well, why weren't these Jewish people sent to the concentration earlier? I was expecting something like this to happen, but no, it happened pretty late in Italy. And again, it was to really appease the Nazis. And I don't think that in earnest, it got really bad, like death camp bad, until Mussolini fell. But then the Nazis came in and ran the country.
Yeah, what happened was these anti-Jewish laws were introduced in November 1938. It basically Mussolini trying to appease Hitler, and so they put those laws into effect. But they didn't actually deport anyone; they just made everyone third-class citizens. And it wasn't until Mussolini fell, the Germans took over the northern section of Italy, that they started rounding up Jews and deporting them to concentration camps, and that didn't happen until 1943. And so there was this 5-year period where Jews in Italy were just third-class citizens. And that's where a lot of this movie takes place. The movie ends in 1943 with the Finzi-Continis family being taken away and locked up in a school of all places. In this place where Mikol has these positive memories of childhood, she then finds as sort of her new prison at the end of the movie. And Giorgio's father is there. And that all happened in 1943. And prior to that, it had just been this slow erosion of civil rights. And there's a part where Giorgio is, he's a student, as I mentioned, and he is at the library studying. And the librarian comes and asks him to leave. And Giorgio is trying to negotiate with him, and this is another line that we see in these movies over and over and over again is the librarian says to him, I can't help you, I have a family. And Giorgio says, all Italy has a family. Basically, everyone is saying they can't do anything to help because they're afraid for themselves. And so Giorgio gets thrown out of the library and luckily is invited by the Finzi-Continis to come and study in their library. And so he gets to experience some of that cloistered safety that they've developed for themselves.
Well, that's another aspect of the film is he's, I guess, a college student, right? And
yeah.
He's studying and trying to get his degree, and through the lens of history, the question mark is almost like what for? Because you're not gonna last long enough to get that degree. But he doesn't know that, and the father, of course, knows that. But pretty soon he's not allowed to attend the university anymore.
There's a point when he's at a Passover dinner at the Finzi-Continis, and they're asking him about how he's doing on his thesis, and they say, "Well, you better finish it soon before literature becomes Aryan." And there's this sort of nervous laughter at the table, and clearly sort of meant as a joke, but not really a joke.
Going back to something you said, the ending of the movie is very tragic, and it's like everything else in the movie. There's not dramatic music. As a matter of fact, when the Finzi-Continis are come, the knocks on the door and they have to come and be taken away, it's all very orderly, almost very pleasant. Yes. There's a lot of prego. And then when they're brought to that school and you get that quick little flashback, I think those are these are little moments in the movie, but are very powerful to show how, just not like a decade before, you're there, an innocent child, and then how quickly things have changed. And maybe when I first saw this film a good 16, 17 years ago now, actually maybe even longer, current world events hadn't happened. But now I look back at the parts of my life that I couldn't imagine the scenarios that we're facing today. But yet here we are facing them, and how quickly dynamics can change.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what's going on with the father here is just kind of an unwillingness to accept that change. It's sort of a disbelief almost, and that this can't really be possible. We're Italians like everyone else. And also, since the fascists had been in power since, 1922?
Right.
And the father actually is a member of the fascist party.
Where the value for me comes in is I want to see these films that actually cover the part at the end, right, is like the sensationalized, again, that last stage, as you say, when things have gotten to the really bad point. But I'm interested in seeing what was the life like living under fascism prior to this? And this film kind of gives you a flavor of that.
It does, and I think the Finzi-Continis, of course, are these aristocrats, and Giorgio's family is middle class because they have servants. They're they're ownership class. They're not working class, and so we don't really actually get the working classes in this movie outside of seeing the servants here and there.
There's definitely a sort of interesting love triangle in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Giorgio, there's allusions that maybe he's gay.
Yeah, there is maybe some subtext there.
Yeah, there's impotence. He can't seem to there's something about him that, as close as he and Nicole are or were as kids, that as a grown-up, she doesn't find him as masculine as this other guy, Fabio, who's kind of like the Italian Sean Connery.
Gian Piero, the communist.
Sorry,
the Italian,
Fabio Testi is the actor, but yeah.
Yeah, Gian Piero is the character, and he's got a great line right at the beginning. He's talking to the brother, whose name I can't remember.
You mean the Alberto Finzi-Continis?
Yes, Alberto. He's talking
by the way, he's played by Helmut Berger, who was the lover of Visconti, and he's in The Damned.
Oh, yes, he is in The Damned. Yeah, okay.
So he was Visconti's lover for years. So just a little aspect, but what's going on with Alberto? He's like a sickly guy.
He's very sickly, and in fact, he skipping ahead, he dies. I forget what he's got. I did read it somewhere, but he dies at the end of the film before they're taken away.
Yeah, and he's on the list, and they're like, he died 6 months ago. Yeah. They just cross him off.
They just cross him off the list. But what's amazing is there's a funeral sequence where they're sort of taking his body through the city, through a funeral procession into the Jewish cemetery. And while this funeral is going on, an air raid siren starts, and people are running around in the streets going, air raid, hide. And the Finzi-Continis completely ignore the air raid as though it has nothing to do with them. They just continue on with their funeral, completely ignoring that that there's a war going on around them, essentially.
By the way, it's the only time they're not in their castle.
Yes, it is. It's the only time they leave is to go to the funeral. I'm surprised they don't have their own cemetery on this.
Well, but now here's another. So we were talking about Gian Piero, and you said there was a great line that he was saying to the brother Alberto at the beginning.
Yeah, so he's talking to Alberto. He says the middle class I don't care for. They're all fascist, more or less, except for you Jews. It's a really important point. I think the film is an indictment of class in a way, and the way that people think they're above things because of their class. And they won't come for me, right? I'm a member of the party. I'm an upstanding fascist. I'm rich. I make contributions. They won't come for me. And then, of course, they do come for you. But I see the Finzi-Continis as being like the last people they came for. They bought their way to be last in line, but they're still in line. And, it's interesting. We see in these Italian films that the uniform for the Italian secret police is a trench coat and a fedora. And so when those guys show up, you know where this is going when you see that uniform.
There's some other films, and more modern, kind of cover these same things. I think they're important, and we may cover them in future episodes and seasons. But the most recent example is this movie called I'm Still Here, and it talks about the dictatorship that happened in Brazil. And similar, when the people show up, the guys show up to question this husband.
Yeah.
They are these dudes in these like slimy, like leather jackets and these hats, and they've almost got this non-uniform, and of course, like I said, this is a tough thing when it's actually happening in your country. There's that tendency to be like, well, this is something else and it's not this. But I mean, we weren't seeing visually these agents of an agency called ICE showing up wearing bandanas over their faces and things, taking people away. And but now we are. That's actually
now we have the visuals of that. But I would argue that, like the father in Finzi-Continis, a lot of people are saying, hey, it's not going to affect me. I've got a comfortable middle-class life. I'm not on the list, so on and so forth. I'm a member of the party, whatever it is. There is this feeling, and I think, the Finzi-Continis, of course, they're aristocrats. We can't relate to that, but we can relate to this idea of feeling safe at home and of thinking that the world won't affect us. I think that's what this film is getting at, is telling us, hey, you will be affected, you will be impacted by this, and just ignoring it isn't going to make it go away or keep you safe. There's another line from Giorgio when he's talking to his father and about this being a third-class citizen and all that stuff. And Giorgio says, "There's always been few enough rights for everyone. We weren't the first to be persecuted. That is true. But we all kept quiet as long as we weren't hit."
And that's the thing is like right there, as long as they stay behind those walls, it's almost as if they feel like, well, we're secure.
Exactly. And that the war is going on outside their walls. There's a point where Giorgio goes to see Nicole. It's sort of his last-ditch effort to say, "But let me be in love with you." And she says no. And he leaves the garden and goes out onto the street and is immediately swept up in a crowd of black shirts. And Mussolini is about to announce that they've declared war. And so the streets are just teeming with these nationalists and fascists, and he's sort of caught up in that. And it's a completely different world than the one Nicole inhabits at that time.
There's a time when Nicole has left the Finzi-Continis. She's like at another part of Italy. They're studying or doing something.
Yeah, she goes away to study for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
And at that point, you'd have to check her neck whether or not she's wearing the Jewish star, because when she's at home, she's wearing the star.
Yeah.
It's very prominent around her neck, but I would wager to say that in the scenes that she's not there, she's not wearing the star.
Okay, I would have to go back and check on that.
But, again, there is this symbolism, and I feel like sometimes it's heavy-handed, but, like, again, this film, it's another interesting movie, and that's why we include it.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of films that try to cover fascism and, maybe seem repetitive to a lot of other things you've seen. So we're trying to find, when possible, interesting looks.
What I find interesting about these types of films is that we don't see the violence until the very end of the movie. We don't see black shirts torturing people or anything like that. We don't see the violence of fascism until they're taken away at the very end.
Yeah, I mean, there's some uncomfortable moments, like the citizens go to the movie theater so that they can see newsreels.
Yes.
And Giorgio's there and he's laughing and scoffing at some of the antics from the Nazis and the fascists. And there's somebody in the audience that's taking offense and being like, like, why don't you shut up? What's wrong with as if like he can't understand why somebody else would not, would find amusement over this, and then labels Giorgio a Jew. And then when he's ushered out of there, his friend's like, hey, look, you gotta be careful because, you're lucky he doesn't know that you actually are Jewish.
You actually are Jewish, yeah. And I think that, that's something that sort of crept into Italian fascism, the anti-Semitism, and that's a lot of what's going on in this movie.
Yeah, and then, but like I said, there's again, especially for early 70s, right? Anything that kind of had whiffs of homosexuality in Giorgio's character, he has this relationship, a friendship with Giampero, but at the same time, a little bit of rivalry. But I also think that he has a bit of a crush on Giampero, and he's as jealous when there's that scene where he goes over the garden wall and he sees that Giampero's in bed with Nicole, and she stands up and she sees him in the window, Giorgio, and she's just staring him down. And it's kind of like, he's a real man. But I think that Giorgio is upset for two reasons. I think he's like upset because he's secretly in love with Giampero, but he's also upset that he's not man enough to have Nicole. And then, of course, Giampero, again, another off-screen thing. A lot of things happen off-screen in this movie. He dies. He is actually sent to war, and he dies.
In Russia.
Yeah. And that was the big fear. It's like they were going to get sent off. And these are like little reminders. It reminds you just how like, what a waste all of this was, right? Like, I think that's when you see these films before the war, you are really struck by how these people's lives are going to be impacted and changed by the war. And we see that in The Conformist. We have that end scene.
Mm-hmm.
We know what's going to happen to the Finzi-Continis most likely. Then on our next film, the next episode we're going to cover is Federico Fellini's Amarcord. And it's a film that, on the one hand, doesn't have that much to do about fascism.
Well, we'll see when we get to it, because
Yeah.
I happen to think the entire thing is about fascism.
Well, see, that's why I want you to watch it, because I think you were struggling at some point, thinking that there's really only one segment of the movie.
And I have a whole nother take on it now. We'll talk about it next time.
Good, I'm glad, because that's, to me, it's a film that's like, I mean, I'm very fascinated about how people lived their lives normally.
Yeah.
While under this kind of belief system.
Another thing to think about here is that with these Italian films from the 70s is that they were recreating Italian memory or commenting on national myth and memory. And so the Conformist, Amarcord, Finzi-Continis are all sort of examining the national memory of this period, and often doing it through a Marxist or Freudian lens. There's plenty of sex going on in these movies. We talked about sort of Giorgio's impotence, and maybe that's sort of a metaphor for the inability to stand up to fascism. But so these films, these Italian films of this era, were really reevaluating. With Fellini, it's his childhood. With these other filmmakers, they're really looking at the national memory, and the films are, in a sense, about memory, but they're trying to get the contemporary Italian audience to reckon with their past. And what's interesting is that this is very different than the post-war German cinema and how they dealt with fascism. For one thing, there's a lot of humor in Italian fascism.
The stories are told by the winners, and for some, aside from maybe having been, if you were killed during the war, if you weren't Jewish and you weren't gay in Italy, you probably did okay. And
right.
That was another movie that kind of comes in at the end of the 70s, which we may get back into talking about in a future season, because we did talk about it at length on our other show, Stuff We've Seen, is A Special Day.
We will definitely be doing a full episode on that. It's worth it.
Yeah, and that's another great film, Italian, about fascism. And then, of course, one of the greatest, I think, films of all time just happens to be Italian. And it covers fascism in the most kind of dark and twisted way of any movie I've ever seen, is Seven Beauties.
Yes. Wait, that's more dark and twisted than The Damned?
In a different way, it is. The Damned is also twisted. I don't know whether we'll cover The Damned, but
we will cover The Damned. There's many, many films to come in the future of this show. Stay tuned.
In the meantime, the next film will be Amarcord. We're getting closer to the end of our first season. And like I said, that's not the end of the show. It's just the end of our first season. We'll take a few weeks breaks and then come back with our next kind of stage of the program. But catch us at fascismonfilm.com, and, on Podbean is where the show is hosted. And also you can get it on Apple Podcasts and other places. But thanks for, keeping the journey going with us, and we look forward to more episodes.
Thank you for listening.
All right, bye.